What happens when the most powerful storytelling machine on the planet, one that reaches over 1 billion people simultaneously, decides to stop being polite? For decades, India absorbed violence, diplomatic doublespeak, and constant pressure to remain restrained while its soldiers were attacked, its cities bombed, and its planes hijacked. Now the message is different. India will tell its own story, on its own terms, and at full volume. That shift raises uncomfortable questions. For the governments accused of enabling violence, for international institutions that often stayed silent, and for the diplomatic narratives that allowed some states to publicly condemn terrorism while quietly supporting it. Because when a country begins to reshape its story, the global conversation around it inevitably begins to change. And the story gets told loudly in front of the largest cinema audience on earth. And once a story is told at that scale, it cannot be untold. My name is not important. What is important is where I am sitting, outside India, watching what is happening inside India with a mixture of astonishment, deep respect, and a growing conviction that the outside world is catastrophically underestimating what is unfolding in Indian cinema right now. And it starts today in this analysis with a trailer for a film called Dhurandhar, The Revenge. Let me be honest about my position. I did not grow up in India, but I have been watching closely. When the first Dhurandhar came out, I reacted to it on this channel, and I remember the response from Indian viewers across the world, from the diaspora in the Gulf, in the United Kingdom, in the United States, in Canada, in Australia. And I remember thinking, this film is touching something that has been untouched for a very long time. Not because it was the first film to address terrorism, not because it was the first Indian action film, but because it was the first film in recent memory to look directly at the documented, historical, deeply uncomfortable reality of what Pakistan's intelligence infrastructure has done to India, and refused to blink, refused to soften, refused to translate it into something more palatable for audiences who might prefer not to be confronted with the truth. And now Dhurandhar. The revenge is arriving, and the world is at a completely different geopolitical moment than when the first film released. The wars have multiplied. The global conversation about state-sponsored terrorism has intensified. The comfortable fictions about certain countries being legitimate diplomatic partners while simultaneously funding violent extremism are becoming harder and harder to maintain. And into this exact moment, this precise, volatile, historically significant moment, this film is dropping like a stone into water. The ripples are going to travel much further than most people currently realize. The trailer opens with a harsh line: Hindus are cowards. It is not presented as fiction, but as a reflection of a documented extremist ideology that has fueled real violence for decades. The story draws from the real events of the Indian Airlines Flight 814 hijacking, a crisis where hostages were taken and the government faced the impossible choice between releasing militants or risking civilian lives. The pain, humiliation, and political dilemma of that moment were real. By revisiting it today, Dhurandhar, The Revenge frames those events not just as action cinema, but as a reminder of the ideology, networks, and historical realities behind the incident. Right now, as this film prepares to release, the world is in a state of profound geopolitical flux. The war in Ukraine has been grinding on, and what that war has done, among many other things, is force the world to confront, painfully and directly, the question of what happens when a state sponsors violence against a neighboring country and the international community responds with diplomatic language rather than decisive action. Ukraine watched that dynamic play out in real time. India has been watching that dynamic play out in slow motion for 40 years. In the Middle East, the ongoing conflict has reignited the global conversation about terrorism, about civilian populations used as shields by violent actors, about the difference between states that sponsor violence and states that experience it. Every country with a history of terrorism is watching that conversation and measuring what it means for their own situation. In the Indo-Pacific, tensions between major powers are recalibrating how every country in the region understands its security interests. India's position as the world's largest democracy, as a country with two nuclear-armed neighbors it has fought wars with, as a country that has experienced more terrorist attacks than almost any other nation on Earth, is becoming increasingly central to global strategic calculations. And into all of this churning, complicated, high-stakes global environment, Dhurandhar, the revenge is about to arrive and tell one of the most important stories that this geopolitical moment contains, the story of what Pakistan's intelligence apparatus has done to India, what it has enabled, what it has funded, what it has protected, what it has denied. And it is going to tell that story not to diplomats in closed rooms, not to academics in journals, not to think tanks in policy papers. It is going to tell it to hundreds of millions of ordinary people who will walk into theaters and walk out having felt something they did not feel before, having understood something they did not understand before, having been moved, not argued into a position, but emotionally moved by a story that has been waiting to be told at this scale for a very long time. That is soft power. And in the current geopolitical environment, soft power is not soft at all. It is one of the most potent forces shaping how nations understand themselves and each other. I want to use a word that might make some people uncomfortable: weaponizing, not in a negative sense, in a precise, geopolitically accurate sense. Stories are weapons. Narratives are weapons. The ability to control how a historical event is understood, who was the victim, who was the aggressor, what the motivation was, what the consequences were, is one of the most potent forms of power that exists in the modern world. Pakistan has for decades been extraordinarily skilled at narrative management. It has positioned itself internationally as a victim of terrorism rather than a sponsor of it. It has cultivated relationships with Western governments and media institutions that have consistently allowed it to present its security services as counterterrorism assets rather than terrorism enablers. It has used the leverage of its geographic position, the gateway to Afghanistan, the nuclear-armed state that Western powers could not afford to alienate, to avoid the level of international accountability that its documented behavior would otherwise demand. The result has been a profound injustice, not just to India, but to everyone who has suffered from the networks that Pakistani intelligence has enabled, protected, and in some cases, directly created. The 2008 Mumbai attacks, the attack on the Indian Parliament in 2001, the Kandahar hijacking, the decades of cross-border terrorism in Kashmir, the documented connections between Pakistani intelligence and groups like Lashkar-e-Taiba and Jaish-e-Mohammed. The evidence, laid out in American court proceedings and intelligence assessments from multiple countries, of active Pakistani state support for violent extremism. All of this exists in the public record. All of it has been documented. And yet the narrative managed by Pakistan's intelligence apparatus and its diplomatic allies has consistently managed to cloud the international perception of what is actually happening. Dhurandhar. The revenge, in my opinion, is a narrative weapon aimed directly at that managed story. It is taking specific, documented events, the career of Ilyas Kashmiri, the atrocities committed against Indian soldiers, the specific ideological framework that motivated the Kandahar hijacking, and it is translating them from the dry language of intelligence reports and court documents into the visceral, emotional, unforgettable language of cinema. And cinema, as a narrative weapon, is more powerful than almost anything else that exists. The character called Major Iqbal in this film is based on a real person, and I think it is worth spending serious time on who that real person was, because understanding him is understanding the entire infrastructure this film is exposing. Ilyas Kashmiri. He was not a simple militant. He was not a lone wolf radicalized by personal grievance. He was a product of a system, a deliberate, organized, state-connected system. He trained with Pakistani special forces. He had documented connections to Pakistani intelligence. He operated for years in the space where Pakistani state power and non-state violent extremism overlap, a space that Pakistani officials have consistently denied exists and that the evidence consistently confirms does. His trajectory took him from being a Pakistani military asset to becoming one of the most significant operational figures in the al-Qaeda network operating out of the Pakistan-Afghanistan border region. He was involved not just in attacks on India, but in planning that crossed multiple international boundaries and threatened multiple countries. In the year 2000, he attacked an Indian army camp in Jammu and Kashmir. Soldiers from the 17 Maratha Regiment were killed, and in an act of deliberate, calculated brutality designed to send a message, not just to India, but to his own sponsors, proof of his ferocity, proof of his commitment. He allegedly beheaded an Indian soldier named Pausaheb Maruti Telekar and took the head to Pakistan, presented it to Pervez Musharraf. I want to stay with that for a moment, not because I enjoy describing violence, but because I think the international community's collective failure to properly reckon with what that act represents, what it says about the state that received it, what it says about the system that enabled it, is one of the most consequential moral failures in recent geopolitical history. This was not a rogue act by an unconnected individual. This was an act committed by someone with documented state connections, presented to the head of state of a country that was simultaneously receiving international aid and diplomatic engagement from Western powers. Where was the outrage? Where were the emergency sessions? Where were the vigils and the change profile pictures and the solidarity marches? They did not come, because it happened to India. And India, in the calculus of international public opinion, has never received the same automatic moral solidarity that certain other countries receive when their citizens are targeted. Dhurandhar. The revenge is, among other things, a demand for that solidarity, delivered in the form of a film rather than a diplomatic note, and delivered to an audience of hundreds of millions rather than a room of diplomats. The IC-814 hijacking in December 1999 is one of those events that every Indian of a certain age carries somewhere inside them, not as a historical fact, as a wound. A plane full of passengers, taken hostage, held for days. The Indian government watching, negotiating, trying to find a way out that did not require surrendering to the hijackers' demands. And ultimately, because the alternative was watching passengers die, releasing convicted terrorists, including Masood Azhar, who would go on to found Jaish-e-Mohammed and be connected to multiple subsequent attacks, including the 2001 attack on the Indian Parliament and the 2019 Pulwama attack that killed 40 Indian security personnel. The decision to release those prisoners, made under impossible circumstances, made under duress, made by people who were trying to save lives and found themselves with no good options, has haunted Indian security thinking for 25 years. Because the people released did not stop. They took their freedom and they used it to continue the violence. And the lesson, the bitter, hard lesson that the Indian security establishment drew from Kandahar, was that certain adversaries interpret restraint as weakness, that certain actors respond to compassion with contempt, that the ideology driving the hijacker who said Hindus are cowards was not going to be moderated by goodwill gestures. That lesson shaped Indian security policy. It contributed to the doctrine that eventually produced the 2016 surgical strikes across the line of control and the 2019 Balakot airstrikes. The doctrine that India would no longer absorb attacks passively, but would respond, directly and forcefully, by striking at the sources of violence. The line in the Dhurandhar trailer, "Pakistan's future will now be decided by India," is the cinematic expression of that doctrine. It is not just a character speaking, it is a nation declaring, through its most powerful cultural medium, that the era of passive absorption is over. And geopolitically, that declaration matters, not because a film causes policy, but because the cultural consensus that a film reflects and reinforces shapes the political environment in which policy is made. When hundreds of millions of people feel something strongly, consistently, and in the same direction, governments respond to that feeling. That is how democracies work. Let me make an argument that I think is important, and that gets too little attention in discussions of cinema and politics. Film is geopolitics, not metaphorically, literally. The stories that a culture tells about itself and about its relationships with other cultures shape the political reality of those relationships in concrete, measurable ways. Look at what Hollywood did for American foreign policy for decades. American films consistently portrayed the United States as a country of heroic individuals fighting for freedom against authoritarian oppression. This narrative, told through thousands of films over decades, distributed globally, translated into dozens of languages, created a global perception of America that was enormously valuable geopolitically. It made people around the world sympathetic to America's international activities, receptive to America's diplomatic positions, and inclined to see American power as essentially benign, even when its actual exercise was anything but. This was not accidental. There is documented historical collaboration between Hollywood and American intelligence and military institutions going back decades. The relationship between the Pentagon and major studios, which provides military equipment and logistical support in exchange for script approval and favorable portrayals, is openly acknowledged. Film is geopolitics, always has been, and what India is now doing, through the Dhurandhar franchise and the broader wave of cinema it represents, is finally building a comparable soft power infrastructure, one that tells India's story at global scale, one that shapes global perception of India's experience, India's history, India's enemies, and India's power. The consequences of that are going to be felt in places far beyond movie theaters, when international audiences, not just Indian diaspora audiences, but genuinely international audiences, start encountering India's experience of terrorism through films of this quality and scale, the conversation changes. When documentary quality storytelling about what Pakistan's intelligence apparatus has done is wrapped inside entertainment compelling enough to cross cultural boundaries, the managed narrative that Pakistan has maintained for decades starts to crack. That cracking is already happening at the diplomatic level. The Financial Action Task Force graylisting of Pakistan, the growing international acknowledgement of the connection between Pakistani state institutions and terrorist networks, the declining patience of Western governments with the double game. Cinema accelerates that process. It creates an emotional consensus that diplomatic arguments struggle to achieve. It makes things real for people who otherwise engage with geopolitics only abstractly. Dhurandhar. The revenge could be a significant acceleration event in that process. Here is something that deserves its own analysis. Something that, if you think about it carefully, tells you almost everything you need to know about the geopolitical stakes of this franchise. The film is reportedly banned or severely restricted in certain Gulf countries. People are apparently arranging travel, actually booking flights, making plans, spending money, to go to countries where the film can be screened, just to watch it in a theater rather than miss the experience. Think about what a ban tells you. A government does not ban a piece of entertainment because it is harmless. Governments ban things because those things threaten something, threaten a narrative, threaten a comfortable fiction, threaten the version of events that serves certain interests. The fact that certain Gulf governments have found Dhurandhar threatening enough to restrict is a form of validation that no marketing campaign could purchase. It is governments themselves confirming that this film contains something dangerous to their preferred story about the region. And what is that story? The story that organizations like Pakistan's ISI are legitimate security actors rather than terrorism sponsors. The story that the violence against India was somehow morally equivalent to India's response. The story that certain forms of terrorism are justified by political grievances and therefore should not be condemned too loudly. When a government bans a film that tells a different story, it is essentially announcing, we are afraid of this story. We do not want our populations to hear it. That fear is geopolitically meaningful. It tells you the film is landing where it needs to land. It tells you the story is reaching people who those governments would prefer to keep in the dark. And here is the other side of that story. The Indian diaspora in the Gulf. Hundreds of thousands of workers and professionals who have left India to build their lives in countries that sometimes treat them with less dignity than they deserve. Those people are finding ways to see this film anyway. They are traveling. They are streaming. They are refusing to accept that the story of their country's courage and suffering should be hidden from them because of where they happen to live. That is devotion. That is not the behavior of a passive audience watching entertainment. That is the behavior of a people engaged in an act of cultural self-affirmation. One of the most geopolitically interesting aspects of Dhurandhar, the revenge, is how it connects two forms of terrorism within one story. The protagonist, Jaskirat Singh Rangi, is rooted in the era of the Khalistan insurgency, a Sikh whose family was targeted by extremists for refusing to support separatism. This matters because the Khalistan issue has not disappeared. Activist groups linked to the movement still operate in countries like Canada, the United Kingdom, Australia, and the United States, sometimes clashing with Indian diplomatic interests abroad. Historically, these networks have also intersected with Pakistan's broader strategy toward India, where support for separatist groups was often viewed as part of asymmetric pressure. By placing a Sikh protagonist at the center of this narrative, the film highlights that the victims and defenders of India come from every community. The result is a powerful counter-narrative, a Sikh character shaped by extremist violence who ultimately chooses to fight for his country, reinforcing the idea that these threats share common roots and affect all Indians alike. Something is happening in India that the world often reduces to nationalism, but the shift is deeper. It is a psychological transformation in how a civilization understands its past and therefore its future. For generations, mainstream narratives emphasize India mainly as a land that endured foreign rule rather than one that shaped history. Yet figures like Maharana Pratap, Bajirao I, Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj, Lachit Borphukan, and Rajaraja Chola I always existed in the historical record, but were often peripheral in the broader national story. Films like Dhurandhar, The Revenge are part of a cultural shift that reconnects audiences with that legacy, not by retelling those exact histories, but by channeling the same spirit of duty, resistance, and civilizational confidence. Even the imagery drawn from the Bhagavad Gita reflects this idea of continuity, the belief that the responsibility to defend what is just does not belong only to the past, but continues in the present. For years, parts of mainstream Hindi cinema avoided directly confronting Pakistan's state and intelligence apparatus. Some of this was commercial, due to distribution ties in Pakistan and allied markets, while some came from an ideological preference for stories of cultural reconciliation that highlighted shared humanity over political conflict. That instinct had artistic value, but at times the balance shifted too far. Some films softened or sidelined the reality of documented terrorist attacks, which inadvertently weakened the public understanding of India's security concerns. The Dhurandhar, the Revenge franchise signals a shift away from that era. By addressing these issues more directly, it reflects a broader change in Indian storytelling, one that is likely to influence how international audiences engage with debates around terrorism and regional geopolitics. Pakistan's future will now be decided by India. It is worth returning to this line because its implications go beyond cinema. It is not a statement from a government briefing or a diplomatic document. It is a line of dialogue from a film. Yet in countries with massive film audiences, powerful dialogue often travels far beyond the screen. There are people in Pakistan, in some Western media, and in certain academic circles who will call Dhurandhar the revenge propaganda or nationalist hysteria. They will try to dismiss the film without engaging with the history it references. But that argument is unlikely to hold. The events the film touches on, from the Indian Airlines Flight 814 hijacking to the activities of Ilyas Kashmiri, are part of a documented historical record. They have been examined through international investigations, court proceedings, and intelligence assessments across multiple countries. In the internet age, those records are accessible. When a film creates the level of public interest that Dhurandhar is generating, many viewers inevitably look up the real events behind it. They encounter reports, testimonies, and documented cases. And when that happens, the claim that the story is pure fiction becomes difficult to sustain. For critics, the challenge is that the historical documentation is already in the public domain.